18-year-old Robert is a little bit nervous today. First date and all. He can hardly believe that he is sitting in his car right now with her, Josi Suarez. Robert had actually always thought that she wasn't interested in him. He always thought that she thought he was kind of a lowlife. But then all of a sudden, a couple of days ago, she asked him out on this date. And who is he to say no? He has got no idea what brought this change of heart. But quite frankly, he doesn't really care. The important thing is they are now on their way to the Peter Pan Motel, where Robert has booked a room for the two of them to wrap up the evening, if you know what I'm getting at. So they get to this room, they close the door, and finally, it's just the two of them. What Robert doesn't know is he was actually right. Josi is not interested in him at all. She's the decoy for the police, who are now carefully approaching the motel room door. They are here to arrest Robert for a murder he did not commit. Welcome to another episode of my true crime podcast, the True Crime Cocktail Hour. This is a Negroni and this is a French 75. And while I'll be mixing us these delicious classic cocktails, I will also tell you the story of a case where every now and again you start to wonder, how the fuck did this happen? So let's not lose any more time and let's get straight into case number 114, the bite mark evidence. Today, we are in Tampa, Florida. After Jacksonville and Miami, the third largest city in the Sunshine State. And it is the year 1983. Now, Robert over here is 18 years old. And so far, life's been tough, you could say. His dad was paralyzed from the waist down after he slipped in a meat freezer. Now, his mom, she was also sick, and so she was not able to take care of the father either. So everything kind of fell on Robert. Household chores, grocery shopping, doctor's appointments. And because all of this shit was happening, Robert eventually was forced to drop out of school and get a job to support his family financially. So long story short, life took one hell of a swing and gave Robert a solid high five right across the face. So whenever Robert is out there driving around, doing what he's got to do, he keeps an eye out for Josi. They, I guess you could say, met a year earlier when she almost ran him over in a bar parking lot. So romantic. So even though she almost got him killed, Robert was immediately smitten. Josi, she was a couple of years older than Robert, and she had this crazy, fancy clothing style. She was simply just more exciting than all the other girls Robert usually met. A few months before they met, Josi had also been in this horrible car accident, and all these months later, she was still dependent on her pain medication, even though rumors had it that she was already being a little bit too loosey-goosey on those pills, if you know what I'm getting at. But Robert, he didn't care. He liked her anyway. On a scorching day in September, a month before they would go on this date together, Robert pulled into a parking lot. Where exactly that was or what he wanted there, no freaking idea. Was not able to find that out. So as Robert was about to get out of the car, he spotted a detective from the Tampa Police Department walking straight toward him. And this is when Robert began to feel a little uneasy because he has a record. Yeah. I mean, it was nothing major, like a couple of months ago, he was caught stealing a couple of tools and a little bit of gasoline. And then he also tried to break into this abandoned house. But Robert did learn his lesson. And he just didn't want to get into trouble. So he was particularly nice to this detective. But apparently his anxiety was completely unfounded. Because surprisingly, the detective wanted Robert to help him with a case. What case that was exactly, the detective did not say. And Robert, to be honest, had no idea how he was supposed to help now. But honestly, he was just glad that he was not the one in trouble. The detective then pulled out a block of soft beeswax and handed it over to Robert. And he told Robert, "Would you bite into this for me?" So Robert, he had no idea that he wouldn't have to do that. He could simply say no. Robert didn't know that. And at the end of the day, he just wanted to get rid of this detective, to be honest. He just wanted to get it over with. So Robert, without asking any questions, took this piece of beeswax and bit into it. After that, he handed it over back to the detective. The detective said thank you and left. Only after the detective had left, it occurred to Robert what this whole dental impression was actually about. This detective was probably investigating this series of murders that had spread across Tampa, Florida during the last summer. So what exactly happened? Starting in July of 1983, several female bodies were found in and around Florida. But apart from their gender, these women had nothing in common, so investigators assumed that they were dealing with separate incidents. But then, in August of 1983, the 19-year-old waitress Barbara Grams disappeared. She had just finished her shift at the fast food restaurant Hot Potato and was on her way back home when she vanished. The next day, her body was found on a grassy area right next to a dental office in Tampa Heights on North Boulevard. Assaulted, robbed, and beaten to death with a wooden beam that was still lying beside her. But her murderer left behind a trace on Barbara's left cheek. A bite mark. Next thing you know, the Tampa police officers were all sent out on patrol with blocks of beeswax, and they were supposed to collect as many dental impressions as humanly possible. But so far, there has been no match. Oh, and by the way, in the case of Barbara Grams, the dental expert, Dr. Richard Zoviron, was brought in. Now, in case his name sounds familiar to you, he was also the dental expert who helped convict serial killer Ted Bundy based on a dental impression in the case of Lisa Levy. And this bite mark was basically all they had at this point. They did find blood and semen traces on Barbara's body, but it is the 80s. You know, it couldn't be analyzed just yet. In any case, Dr. Richard Zoviron now compared the next few collected dental impressions with the bite mark found on Barbara's body, and he got a match. The bite mark matched the dental impression of Robert. So next, investigators were thinking, okay, how do we do this? How do we approach Robert? So they found out that he had this thing for this girl, Josi. So they walked up to her, asked for her help. She agreed and asked Robert out on this date. So the two of them went through the bars of Tampa and then took this really nice romantic walk and then headed to the motel. But as soon as they arrived in their room, there all of a sudden was this loud stomping outside, coming closer and closer before it stopped altogether right in front of their motel room door. Next thing you know, someone is banging on this door. So Robert gets up, he walks over to the door and he opens it. And he actually expected someone to be like, sorry, wrong room. But surprisingly, he was looking at an officer of the Tampa Police Department. We need you to come with us right now. So they told Robert this story about how his mother was feeling very unwell. They needed to bring Robert to her. That was the story. And even though Robert was wondering, okay, but there are 6 police officers here, why is that necessary? He, again, did not ask any questions. He just said goodbye to Josi and got into this police car. But as soon as he sat down and they closed the police door, Robert again started to get this really uneasy feeling. And he felt like something was off. Because minutes passed and they still hadn't moved an inch from the parking lot. And then all of a sudden, the officer sitting on the passenger seat in this police car turned around to Robert and he looked him straight in the face. And this officer asked, so why did you do it? And Robert was like, do what? So the police officer asked again, why did you murder her? And again, Robert was like, murder who? So this police officer, he didn't answer. He just gave Robert this weird, strange grin. And that grin, that was it. That was when Robert realized that this was all a setup. Josi the date, sick mother my ass. Now, Robert was questioned, and naturally, during this interrogation, he was supposed to explain how his bite mark got on the left cheek of Barbara Graham's, which obviously he couldn't because he had nothing to do with it. Even another examination of his teeth did not disprove the dental expert's theory. The good news was, though, that there was no other evidence or indication that Robert had something to do with this. So he tried to stay positive, and he was convinced that the trial would end well for him. But he was wrong. So 1 year after the murder of Barbara Graham's in 1985, the trial against Robert for murder and assault began. And you gotta imagine Robert, 18 or 19 years old, in his dark blue suit, sitting right next to his defense attorney, and Robert did not show any kind of emotion. He never confessed to anything. Just like the entire year before, he maintained his innocence. He even passed the polygraph test. But the fact that he didn't show any kind of emotion or remorse was not sitting well with some people present. To make matters worse, the presiding judge, Henry Lee Coe III, was said to be a very unforgiving man, and he was also a fan of the death penalty. By the way, his nickname was Hanging Harry. So him being the presiding judge didn't really help his case. Next, the dental expert, Dr. Richard Zoviron, the man with the Bundy bonus, took the stand and told the jury that the bite mark, quote-unquote, with high probability came from Robert. Now, the defense obviously tried to question the accuracy of this comparison, because what you gotta know is Dr. Richard Zoviron did not go and compare the original bite mark, the tissue, to the dental impression, but he made this connection based on photographs. So you need to know that they took the tissue around the bite mark and put it in formaldehyde to preserve it, which it did, but it also causes the tissue to shrink. So bottom line, not even this important piece of evidence was in its original state anymore. Nevertheless, it was Dr. Richard Zoviron we're talking about, and because of his success in the Ted Bundy case, no one really dared to question his results. So then, the next witness took the stand, and Robert was quite surprised to see that it was his cellmate, a man called Claude Butler. Robert can hardly believe his ears when he hears Claude Butler telling the jury under oath that Robert and him are good friends and that they already knew each other before being incarcerated, which was a straight up lie. They met like 2 weeks ago while brushing their teeth in their cell. So this guy was straight up lying to the court. But it gets worse. Next thing you know, Claude Butler is sitting there and he tells the jury that on Christmas Day last year, Robert DuBoise had confessed the murder of Barbara Graham to him while they were watching TV, because nothing is more Christmassy. Robert could not believe it, but he was like, why would he make this up? Well, what nobody knew at this time was that Claude Butler over here had a nice deal with the prosecution, because his own trial was coming up in a couple of weeks and he was facing life imprisonment for robbery, kidnapping, and I think the assault of a police officer, right? So when the prosecution learned about this Claude Butler guy and found out that he was the cellmate, they walked up to Claude and they were like, hey Claude, you know, if you get a confession out of your cellmate, maybe there's something we can do for you. So Claude agreed, and he really tried his best. But he got nowhere with it. Robert would not confess shit to him. So as the day of the trial came closer and closer, and Claude had still no confession to present to the prosecution, he started to panic. And so he decided to just make up this confession to save his own ass. Now the prosecution, they did not question his statement one bit. I mean, why would they? They got what they wanted. By the way, Claude Butler only got 5 years in the end. Just saying. The jury deliberated for a day and a half and came back with a clear verdict. 12 votes to 0. Robert was found guilty of the murder of Barbara Grams and was sentenced to death by the electric chair. So the next 3 years, Robert was on death row. And while he was there, he was reminded every single week what awaited him. Because you see, every Wednesday, 1 p.m., they test Old Sparky. And whenever they test Old Sparky, all the lights in the cell will flicker. So there's some extra torture. So after spending 3.5 years on death row, Robert learned that his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment, which was great for a second. I mean, he would never meet Old Sparky. That's good. But instead, he was transferred to the worst prison of Tampa, Florida. And he also lost his right to a public defender. So all Robert could do at this point is write letters. Write letters to the newspapers, to politicians, anyone who would listen, and anyone who could possibly help him get out of this prison and prove his innocence. But no one answered. Fortunately, though, Robert found a good way to deal with everyday prison life and kind of get through it. You see, he was very skilled with his hands and soon became the official handyman of the prison, right? He fixed anything that was broken, clogged, or needed repair of some sort, right? And because of that, he earned the respect of the guards and was also left alone by his other inmates because they needed him. I mean, you do not want to mess with the guy who can fix your toilet if it clogs. And so year after year passed. And I don't want to even say it, but we're going to make a little time jump right now to the year 2008. You do the math. Yeah. Robert has spent the last 23 years in prison. The only bright spot during these years was the kitchen help, a woman named Lourdes Sanchez. So what happened was, Lourdes, the kitchen help, she left her keys in a door in prison, right? And Robert was the one who found the keys. He took them with him just to give it back to her the very next day without anyone noticing, because quite frankly, this is something she could get fired for, right? So this is how Robert and Lourdes met, and they fell in love. Lourdes even quit her job for Robert because a relationship between an inmate and an employee of the prison was forbidden. They even got engaged. Yeah. And again, Robert started to feel a little bit of hope. Like maybe he was going to be released soon and maybe there was still something good waiting for him out there. So every now and again, Robert had one of these court hearings to determine whether he could be released or not. But in order for you to get released, you have to take responsibility for the crime, but also show remorse for it, right? And Robert did neither because he didn't commit the murder. Of course, he could easily fake it. One sentence, that's all it takes, and maybe looking a little bit sad, and he would be free. But he couldn't. He couldn't bring himself to do this. So again, year after year passed. And this is so sad, but eventually Robert, he ended his engagement with Lourdes, not because he didn't love her, but because he did not want her to wait for him the rest of her life and forget to live her own life instead. So we make another time jump. Yeah, I'm so sorry. 13 years. It's now the year 2020. Robert has been in this freaking prison for 37 years. But then in the year 2020, Robert finally received the letter he had been waiting for 13 years. Because 13 years ago, he had written a letter to the Innocence Project. I think you heard of this project. It's really great. But for those of you who don't know, this project is a group of lawyers and attorneys who specialize in wrongful convictions, and their track record is off the hook. And now they finally responded, and they offered to help Robert. Just a couple of days later, in February of 2020, Robert was led into the visiting room where he sat down right across from his new attorney. And his new attorney was a woman named Susan Friedman. Now, Susan Friedman, she was still quite young. She was born the year Robert was incarcerated. But despite her young age, she already had a lot to offer career-wise. Not only did she hold a degree in law, but also in biomedical sciences with a focus on DNA technology. So shortly after meeting Robert, she filed a 156-page-long motion for retrial, and the timing could not have been better. For one, DNA technology had advanced so much over the last 37 years. Second of all, Andrew Warren had just been elected the new state attorney of Tampa, Florida. And one of the first things he did was to create a re-investigation unit, a full team of officers solely dedicated to old cases where a wrongful conviction was suspected. Now, obviously, what they had to do now is prove Robert's innocence. And that was supposed to happen with the blood and semen traces that were found on her body. Oh, look, bad news. Here we go. The samples were destroyed routinely in 1990. However, shortly after, Susan Friedman learned that sometimes, in very rare cases, medical examiners will keep slides or samples they took from the body and keep it in some old refrigerator somewhere down in the basement for years, if you are really lucky. So Susan Friedman walked over to this medical examiner's office. She went down to the basement and went through all the refrigerators of the 80s. It's worth a shot, right? And Susan cannot believe it. But eventually, she held a little box in her hands with slides in it. And the label read, grams, dated 19th of August, 1983. There were still slides left of this case. No one had been looking for it for the last 37 years. So Susan had these samples retested and compared to Robert's DNA, and the result was Robert's DNA did not match any of the traces found at the crime scene. They also found out that the traces did not come from only just one person, but two. And these two individuals had long since come into contact with law enforcement, meaning their DNA was saved in the database. So the investigators of this re-investigation unit ran the profiles again, and there's a match, baby. The traces, the DNA, match convicted murderers Abram Scott and Amos Robinson. Now get this. Abram Scott and Amos Robinson went to prison for the murder of a young man on October the 21st, 1983, the same day Robert went on his date with Josi and got arrested. But there's more, and you will not believe this, okay? Abram Scott, Amos Robinson, and Robert spent 3 years together on death row in the same prison, just a few cells apart. Yes. So after the results came in, Robert was released within a couple of days after 37 years. His story went around the globe. People were really, really shocked about this miscarriage of justice. But an apology from any investigator? Nah. Also, no compensation either. At least at first, because you remember, he stole that power drill like 40 years ago. So according to the state of Florida, that's why he lost his right for compensation for the 37 years he had spent in prison. And he was actually entitled to $1.85 million, which I think is nothing. A little while later, however, Robert sued the state of Florida and Dr. Richard Sauviron for misconduct and falsified evidence. And in 2024, they settled for $14 million, which is a beginning. Today, Robert lives in his own house with a nice pool, but he still works as a handyman. None of the investigators ever apologized to him. The only one who did ever apologize was Dr. Richard Sauviron. Also, Lourdes, his ex-fiancée, the kitchen help, you remember? She reached out again to Robert, and when I read that, I was like, oh yes, please get back together. But Robert hasn't responded yet. I guess he just needs some time to find his place in this new world. So I think to end today's case, why don't we let speak Robert for himself?
I don't have room in my life for bitterness. Bitterness, if you keep hatred and bitterness in your heart, it just steals your joy from everything else.
And that, my dear listeners, was case number 114, the bite mark. Thank you so much for hanging out with me again. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Just a little bit on bite mark evidence, because I did a little research. And actually, the science behind bite mark evidence is highly controversial. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense, you know, bear with me. Like, skin is elastic, right? And it's also different from person to person. So it is actually impossible to reproduce the same bite mark over and over again, right? If you would bite a person tomorrow and then next week another person, these bite marks would not be the same. Also, a victim moves, fights back. A wound can swell. Like, how can you tell? I also read somewhere that today experts are not even sure anymore whether this mark on Barbara Graham's left cheek was actually a bite mark after all. So if you ever watch a documentary and they talk about bite mark evidence, take it with a grain of salt, okay? All right, next week, we're staying in the United States of America for our next case, but next time we're heading to California, and we'll be talking about a case that is actually well known, but was maybe forgotten by a lot of people by now. And it's also a wild story. So I'm really looking forward to that. Until then, have a lovely weekend. Try to relax a little bit. Kiss. Mwah. And I'll see you next time.